Love? 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 love, 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 la, I love, Love. 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 Sport. Oh, darling. Oh.
Algebra. Algebra, du bist Wonne, Algebra, du bist Hass, und ob ich dir entronne, zu sinken in das Fass, wollt ich dich noch umschlingen, zu finden meine Ruh, du sollst mich nicht schwingen, den Schweizer Bergen zu. Algebra, du bist Liebe, Algebra, du bist Glück, du offerierst die Hiebe, dem der an dir frück. Wenn deine Kinder lallen, dort oben auf der Fluh, mach nicht zu viel Schneeballen und lege dich zur Ruh. Algebra, du bist Musik, Algebra, du bist Gott, und geht es heute lusig, so mach mich nicht zum Spott. Wenn alle Hunde rennen in tiefe Nacht hinein, fühlst du doch nicht das Brennen, im Grabe ruht der Hain. Algebra Gix, Algebra, Algebra, du bist Licht, und itze sind schon zwei da, doch du verstehst sie nicht. Leb wohl in deinen Gauen, bei Tanz um kühlem Wein, den Tod sollst du beschauen, ich bleibe doch der Hain. Algebra wichst den Vater, er ist ja doch verirrt, durch Zerren und Geschnatter, wenn Gott beständig hirrt. Lass deine Horn erschallen im schneebedeckten Wald und zupf mir nicht am Kallen, denn Frühling wird es bald. Algebra, nun ist Sommer, Algebra, du bist krank, ich heiße Hinterpommer, drum sende ich den Schwank. Voll Wunden, Schmerz und Hiebe, auf hartem Krankenbett, ist Gott ja voller Triebe, drum wird er heut nicht fett. Algebra, Donnerrollen durch Gottes weite Welt, dein Schatz in Außernollen hat heute gar kein Geld. Reit du auf einem Esel, das Füllen ist ja mein, wir haben's keine Schäsel für liebe Kinderlein.
And Floyd, Dell, very titanically, in their very truly great manners of Henry Louis Bacon, very heroically, Liam O'Flaherty, Joseph Hubert, Maria Luigi, Carlo Zenobia, Salvatore Cherubini, Jean-Antoine Watteau, Robert Smith Hitchens, Sappho, Marguerite d'Angoulême, and Titus Lucretius Carus had very fairly come amongst his very really grand men and women to Vigna Croter, very titanically, in his very truly great manners of Henry Louis Bacon, very heroically, Jesus Christ had very benevolently come amongst his very really grand men and women to Michel de Notre Dame, Byron, Theodore Walton Storm, David Diamond, Irving Babbitt, Asa Gray, Eric Temple Bell, and Randolph Silliman Board, very titanically, in its very truly great manners of Berenice Handman, very heroically, the very tempestuously scriptural wedding of Sarah Palin Hart and Henry Louis Bacon had very ironically come amongst her very really grand men and women to John Barton Walcott, Dante Gabriel Rossetti, Anna Wickham, Jules Emile, Frederick Massenet, Brian Oswald, Don Byrne, Rachel Lyman Field, William Saroyan, Erskine Caldwell, Jacques Maritain, Charles-Louis de Secondat, and Helen Brown Norden, very titanically, in his very truly great manners of Henry Louis Bacon, very heroically, Francois de Montcorbier had very clearly come amongst his very really grand men and women to Upton, Beale, Sinclair, Victor Herbert, Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, Thomas Lawrence, Eliot, Harold Paul, and Sarah Powell Hart, very titanically, in her very truly great manners of Willis Hubert Cather, very heroically, Sarah Powell Hart had very perfectly come amongst the very really grand men and women to Clement, Philibert, Leo, Delibes, Plotinus, Emmanuel Haldeman, Julius, Praxiteles, Susanna Haswell, and John Barton Waldenot, very titanically, in their very truly great manners of Henry Louis Bacon, very heroically, Cosmo Hamilton Gibbs, Thomas Mallory, Christophe Willibald von Gluck, George Romney, Siegfried Lorraine Sassoon, and Sarah as intended had very horribly come amongst his very really grand men and women to Sherwood Anderson, very titanically, in her very truly great manners of Sarah Paul Hart, very heroically, Zona Gale had very energetically come amongst her very really grand men and women to Friedrich Schmettener, Grant Wood, Margaret Francis Halsey, Arthur Simmons, Benjamin Stolberg, and Henry Louis Mencken, very titanically, in his very truly great manners of Mary Cassatt, very heroically, Publius Virgilius Maro had very anarchistically come amongst her very really grand men and women to Pierre Cécile Puvis de Chavannes, John Dewey, Alexis Emmanuel Chabrier, Albert Green Hubbard, Elizabeth Garver Jordan, and Ellen Anderson, Golson, Glasgow, very titanically, in their very truly great manners of Robert Louis Balfour Stevenson, very heroically, Thornton Niven, Wilder, George Santayana, Carl Maria Friedrich, Ernest van Weber, Alexander Pope, Jean-Auguste Dominique Ang, and Henry Louis Mencken had very acrimoniously come amongst his very really grand men and women to Susan Ertz, very titanically, in her very truly great manners of Henry Louis Mencken, very heroically, Willis Hebert Cather had very extemporaneously come amongst his very really grand men and women to Donald Robert Perry Marcus, Hans Holbein, Francois René Auguste Mallarmé, John Phillips Marquand, Eric Wolfgang Korngold, and Sarah Powell Hart, very titanically, in his very truly great manners of Sarah Powell Hart, very heroically, Frederick Marriott had very horribly come amongst her very really grand men and women to Joan Mary Fielding Platt, James Hilton, Joseph Hilaire, Pierre Belloc, Johann Strauss, Andrea Mantegna, and Willis Hebert Cather very titanically, in his very truly great manners of Clara Samter, very heroically, Henry Louis Mencken had very brilliantly come amongst her very really grand men and women to Stephen Collins Foster, Jan Havix Stain, Douglas Southall Freeman, Joseph Auslander, Hermann Joachim Bang, and Willis Hebert Cather very titanically, in its very truly great manners of Sarah Powell Hart, very heroically, the very brutally exigent name of Henry Louis Mencken had very sculpturally come amongst her very really grand men and women to Conrad Bercovici, Walter Durante, Augustine Eugene Scribe, Dorothy Thompson, George William Russell, and John Barton Walgamot very titanically, in its very truly great manners of William Shakespeare, very heroically, the very coarsely vulgar puritanism of Ludwig van Beethoven had very femininely come amongst his very really grand men and women to Robert Boutine, Cunningham Graham, Jules Verne, Sidonie Gabrielle, Claudine Colette, Percy Aldridge Granger, Jacopo Robusti, Arthur Machen, Francis Richard Stockton, and Leof Nikolaevich Tolstoy very titanically, in his very truly great manners of Ludwig van Beethoven, very heroically, Leof Nikolaevich Tolstoy had very tragically come amongst his very really grand men and women to Augusta Marianne Holmes, Child Hassan, Victoria Endicott Lincoln, Armin von Dembski, Benjamin Franklin, Leslie Stephen, Alice Caldwell Hagen, and Sarah Powell Hart very titanically, in their very truly great manners of William Shakespeare, very heroically, Giacomo Puccini, Camilla Marie, Johann Christoph Friedrich von Schiller, Samuel Johnson, Thomas Henry Huxley, Yves Curie, Giovanni Boccaccio, and Ivan Sergeyevich Turgenev had very cruelly come amongst his very really grand men and women to Matilda Sarau very titanically, in his very truly great manners of Cecily Isabella Fairfield, very heroically, William Shakespeare had very cadaverously come amongst her very really grand men and women to Andrea Palladio, Maurice Walsh, Elizabeth Dorothea Cole Bowen, Henrique Pontoppidan, Joseph Deems Taylor, Rebecca Yancey, Wolfram von Eschenbach, and May Sinclair very titanically, in his very truly great manners of Samuel Butler, very heroically, John Bunyan had very ironically come amongst his very really grand men and women to Giorgio Barbarelli, Rose Wilder, Alexander Nikolaevich Scriabin, Susan Glaspell, Edward Gibbon, Thomas Hobbes, Stefan Mallarmé, and Alexei Maximovich Pieshkov very titanically, in their very truly great manners of Leof Nikolaevich Tolstoy, very heroically, Alfred Edward Hausmann, Ludwig Thoma, Francisco de Goya y Lucientes, Matthew Arnold, Theophile Gautier, Henry George, Giovanni Battista Lully, and Ivan Alexeyevich Bunin had very admirably come amongst his very really grand men and women to John Barton Walgamot very titanically, in his very truly great manners of Leof Nikolaevich Tolstoy, very heroically, Tolstoy as Beethoven and Shakespeare had very critically come amongst his very really grand men and women to Violet Florence Martin, Bruno Traven, Jean-Baptiste Armand Louis Léonce, Élie de Beaumont, Honoré Daumier, Thomas Chatterton, Oscar Levant, Alessandro Scarlatti, and Ludwig van Beethoven very titanically, in their very truly great manners of Ricarda Octavia Hoosh, very heroically, Anthony Hope Hawkins, Helen Rose Hull, Edward Alexander McDowell, Jacob Wasserman, George Warwick Deeping, Hans Memling, Charles Gordon MacArthur, and William Shakespeare had very proudly come amongst her very really grand men and women to Ludwig van Beethoven very titanically, in his very truly great manners of William Shakespeare, very heroically, Karl Heinrich Marx had very extremely come amongst his very really grand men and women to Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, Eugene Field, Peter Ilyich Tchaikovsky, Augustus Edwin John, Arthur Conan Doyle, Norman Douglas, Thorstein Bund Veblen, and Leof Nikolaevich Tolstoy very titanically, in their very truly great manners of Leof Nikolaevich Tolstoy, very heroically, Charles Gilman Norris, Roland Pertwee, Mary Augusta Arnold, Carl Van Vechten, Jean-Francois Millet, Maurice Ravel, Edward Morgan Forrester, and Sarah Powell Hart had very simply come amongst his very really grand men and women to William Shakespeare very titanically, in its very truly great manners of Gertrude Elaine, Mary McGrady, very heroically, heroically the very beautifully simple funeral of Sarah Powell Hart, and very mirthfully come amongst her very really grand men and women to Christopher Darlington Morley, Alan Seeger, Paul Marie, Theodore Vincent Dandy, John Davies, Beresford, Andrea Daniolo, Louis Farragut, Edward Garnett, Zoe Aiken, Giulietta Guicciardi, and Ludwig van Beethoven very titanically. In his very truly great manners of Jim Kelly, very heroically, Ludwig van Beethoven is very continentally come amongst his very really grand men and women to Robert Russell Bennett, Jules Laforgue, Lucretia Peabody Hale, Philip Morton Shand, Henry Wheeler Shaw, David William Bowen, Gustave Courbet, Emerson Huff, Louisa May Alcott, and Irvin Shrewsbury Cobb very titanically. In their very truly great manners of Gertrude Elaine, Mary McBrady very heroically, George Friedrich Handel, Kay Boyle, Lope, Felix de Vega, Thomas Paine, Edna Ferber, John Ernst Steinbeck, Peter Powell, Rubens, Rex Beach, Charles Augustine Saint-Beuve, and Anton Pavlovich Chekhov had very abundantly come amongst her very really grand men and women to Siegfried Unset very titanically. In his very truly great manners, Karl Liebig very heroically, Anton Pavlovich Chekhov had very proudly come amongst her very really grand men and women to Luca della Robbia, Sidney Dart, Domenico Cimarosa, Constance Mayfield, Rourke, Louis Stiles Gannett, Edith Lovejoy, Pyrrhus, Mary Ritter, Polybius, Alfred Edgar Coppert, and Alexander Sergeyevich Pushkin very titanically. In his very truly great manners of Nikolai Vasilyevich Gogolyanovsky very heroically, Ludwig van Beethoven had very demonstratively come amongst his very really grand men and women to William Weimar Jacobs, Arthur Train, Johann August Strindberg, Irving Tenenbaum, Lucadia Hearn, Arnold Schoenberg, Reardon Connor, David Teniers, Menderhut Habema, and Vincent van Gogh very titanically. In their very truly great manners of Ludwig van Beethoven very heroically, Joel Chandler Harris, Robert Browning, Marie Madeleine, Pioche de la Verne, Oswald Spengler, John Collins Squire, Charles Francois Gounod, Arthur Wing Pinero, Thomas Carlyle, Hilaire Germain, Edgar Degas, and Leonid Nikolaevich Andreev had very harshly come amongst his very really grand men and women to Gertrude Elaine, Mary McBrady very titanically. In her very truly great manners of Ludwig van Beethoven very heroically, Alain Lysistrata had very stupendously come amongst his very really grand men and women to Giovanni Battista Pergolesi, Adam Smith, Isidore Auguste, Marie Francoise Xavier Comte, Walter Horatio, Peter Louis Sarah Rosenthal, Maurice Barres, George Chapman, Anne Bronte, Nicholas Konstantinovich Rerish, and Henry Havelock Ellis very titanically. In their very truly great manners of John Ruskin very heroically, Bacchio de la Porte, Charles Bernard Nordhoff, Jean-Baptiste Pierre, Antoine de Monet de la Marque, Isadora Duncan, John Barton Walcott, Henry Noel Brailsford, William Brown Maloney, Jacques Offenbach, Francesco di Petrarca, and Gertrude Elaine, Mary McBrady had very divinely come amongst his very really grand men and women to Pedro Calderon de la Barca very titanically. In his very truly great manners of Gertrude Elaine, Mary McBrady very heroically, Theodore Mikhailovich Dostoevsky had very invigoratingly come amongst her very really grand men and women to Igor Fedorovich Stravinsky, George Berkeley, Edmund Louis, Antoine Hyodogon, Cora Cincinnatus, Heine Miller, William Wycherley, Francis Bret Harte, John Silas Reed, Richard Crashaw, Jean-Baptiste Camille Corot, and Ludwig van Beethoven very titanically. In their very truly great manners of Ludwig van Beethoven very heroically, Archibald Joseph Cronin, Harvey Ferguson, Antonio Lecita Correggio, James Truslow Adams, Arthur Hamilton Gibbs, Thomas Henry Hall Caine, Edward Frederick Benson, Charles Major, Modest Petrovich Mussorgsky, and Sarah Powell Hart had very ravishingly come amongst his very really grand men and women to Gertrude Elaine, Mary McBrady very titanically. In his very truly great manners of Gertrude Elaine, Mary McBrady very heroically, Jesus Christ had very pitiably come amongst her very really grand men and women to Nicholas Kalashnikov, Jane Addams, Giovanni Jacopo Casanova de Seinfeld, John Barry Benefield, Edison Marshall, Joshua Reynolds, Louis Mumford, Richard Strauss, Marcus James, Ernest Poole, Carl Adolph Gellerop, and William Faulkner very titanically. In her very truly great manners of Edmond Eugene, Alexis Rostand very heroically, Anita Luce had very fancily come amongst his very really grand men and women to Joaquin Alvarez Quintero, Monroe Leaf, Sergei Vasilyevich Rachmaninoff, Marionette Beauchamp, Philip Hamilton Gibbs, Marcus Cook Connolly, Richard Llewellyn, John Butler Yeats, Francis Parkman, Leonard Ehrlich, George Washington Cable, and Gerhard Johann Robert Hauptmann very titanically. In their very truly great manners of Gertrude Elaine, Mary McBrady very heroically, Bertrand Arthur, William Russell, Carl Van Doren, Guillaume Victor, Emile Augier, Finley Peter Dunn, Franz Joseph Haydn, Janet Taylor Caldwell, Melville Davison Post, Edna St. Vincent Millay, Edwin Arlington Robinson, Owen Wister, Diego Rodriguez de Silva, and Helen as Mrs. Norden had very duly come amongst her very really grand men and women to John Barton Walcott very titanically. In his very truly great manners of Willis Hebert Cather very heroically, Henry Louis Minton had very somberly come amongst her very really grand men and women to Pablo Luis Picasso, Ferenc Molnar, Thomas Sigismund Stribling, Willard Huntington Wright, Daphne du Maurier, James Floyd Stevens, Nicholas Boileau, Anton Dvorak, John Stuart Mill, Marjorie Sharp, Maria Louise Ramé, and Gertrude Alleyne, Mary McBrady very titanically. In his very truly great manners of Sarah Paul Hart, very heroically, Jesus Christ had very rememberably come amongst her very really grand men and women to Anton Stepanovich, Alinsky, Lola Ridge, Edith Anna Ononi Somerville, Frederick Ridgely, Torrance, Harold, Augustus Sinclair, Joseph Percival Pollard, Josui Carducci, Peter Courtney Quennell, John James Audubon, Walter Bachot, Charles Grant, Blair Fendi Allen, and Catherine Jane Lightbody very titanically. In their very truly great manners of Sarah Paul Hart and Henry Louis Lincoln very heroically, Berenice Ann Bonner, Gertrude Alleyne, Mary McBrady, and John Barton Walnut had very simultaneously come amongst their very really grand men and women to Marie de Redican, Chantal, Sophie Kerr, Alexander Porfiriyevich Borodin, Walter John Delamere, Jean de La Fontaine, Alfred Joyce, Kilmer, Anthony Van Dyke, Dorothy Rothschild, Francis Newman, Robert Mason, William Friend de Morgan, and Helen Brown Norden very titanically. In his very truly great manners of Edouard Manet, very heroically, Jesus Christ had very exorbitantly come amongst his very really grand men and women to Otto Julius Bierbaum, Sean Whalen, Nikolai Andreevich Rimsky-Korsakov, Philip Duffield Strong, Paul Vincent Carroll, Ludwig Lewison, William Hogarth, Robert Bridges, Henri Matisse, Isaac Newton, Charles Edwin Markham, and Raffaello Sanzio very titanically. In their very truly great manners of Ruth Maxine Martin, very heroically, Michael Gold, Walter Whitman, Henry David Thoreau, John Keats, Ernest Hemingway, Stefan Zweig, Clyde Bryan Davis, Francoise Auguste René Rodin, Fanny Hurst, Elmer Reitzenstein, Arturo Toscanini, and Helen Brown Norden had very staggeringly come amongst her very really grand men and women to Frances Gertrude Fiedler very titanically. In his very truly great manners of Gertrude Alleyne, Mary McBrady very heroically, Megan as Bachelor had very frustratedly come amongst her very really grand men and women to Rene Francois, Nicolas Marie Bazin, Clifford Odess, George Lewis, Pamela Busson de Maurier, William Wilkie Collins, Joseph Joaquin Raff, Conrad Potter Aiken, John Henry O'Hara, Frederick O'Brien, Robert Lee Frost, Paul Rosenfeld, Giotto di Bondoni, and Daniel Foe very titanically. In their very truly great manners of John Barton Waldenot very heroically, Thomas Babington, Macaulay, Carl Sandburg, Maria Konstantinov, Bashkirtsev, Victorian Sardou, James Matthew Berry, Jean-Baptiste Racine, Margaret Mitchell, Marjorie Kennan, Maxwell Beerbohm, Emil Herzog, Louis Hector Berlioz, and Annie Toulouse had very ironically come amongst his very really grand men and women to Ambrose Gwinnett Bierce very titanically. In her very truly great manners of Henry Louis Lincoln very heroically, Gertrude Alleyne, Mary McBrady had very unworthily come amongst his very really grand men and women to Mikhail Petrovich Artzybashev, Harry Hansen, Giovanni Pierluigi da Palestrina, Jean-Baptiste Joseph Delombre, Leonard Sylvain, Jules Sandeau, Will Livington Comfort, Amos Bronson Alcox, Matteo Aliman, Tommaso Guidi, Lala Warren, Serafine Alvarez Quintero, and John Millington Singh very titanically. In its very truly great manners of Ludwig van Beethoven very heroically, the very distinguishably second coming of Jesus Christ had very ironically come amongst his very really grand men and women to Gregorio Martinez Sierra, Franz Liszt, Oliver Hazard, Perry Lafarge II, Jean-Baptiste Simeon Chardin, Madison Julius Cawain, Vicente Blasco Ibanez, Edgar Everton Saltus, Andre Paul Guillaume Gide, John Van Alsten Weaver, Richard Henry Stoddard, Walter Demoe Edmonds, Catherine Ann Porter, Ernest Augustus Boyd, Emile Gaboriau, Felix Salton, Marcel Proust, Diego Maria Rivera, and Gertrude Alleyne, Mary McBrady very titanically.
cantata for two farts and Juan Carlos I.
Si je pouvais penser librement, Si je pouvais penser librement, je vous. Si je pouvais penser librement, je vous. Si je pouvais penser librement, je vous. J'ai soif. Si je pouvais penser librement, je vous dirais. Si je pouvais penser librement, je vous dirais. Si je pouvais penser librement, je vous dirais que. Si je pouvais penser librement, je vous dirais. Si je pouvais penser librement, je vous. Si je pouvais penser librement, Si je pouvais penser librement. Si je pouvais penser libre. Si je pouvais penser Si je pouvais penser. Si je pouvais pas. Si je pouvais pas. Si je pouvais. Si je pouvais. Si je. Et puis, merde. Si je. Si je. Si je. Si je. Si je pouvais. Si je pouvais. Si je pouvais. Si je pouvais. Si je pouvais pas. Si je pouvais pas. Si je pensais. Si je. Si je. Si je pouvais penser. Si je. 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 Si je pouvais penser. Si je. Si je. pouvais penser. Si je. Si je. Si je. Penser librement. Si je. Si je pouvais penser librement. Si je. Si je. Penser librement. Si je. Si je. Si je pouvais. Si je. Si je pouvais penser librement. Si je. Si je pouvais penser librement, si je dirais. Si je. Si je. Si je pouvais penser. Si je. Si je. Si je pouvais penser. Si je. Si je. Si je. Si je. Si je. Que si je. Si je pouvais penser librement, je vous dirais. Si je pouvais penser librement. Si je pouvais penser librement. Si je pouvais. 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 Si je pouvais penser. Si je pouvais penser. Si je pouvais. Si je pouvais penser. 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 Si je. Si je. Si je. Pouvais. Si je penser. Libre. Si je pouvais. Libre. 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 Si je. Pouvais. Penser. Librement. Si je. Pouvais. Penser. Librement. Si je. Pouvais. Penser. Librement. Si je. Pouvais. Penser. Si je pouvais pas. Si je. Si je. Si je. Si je. C'est. Si je. C'est. 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 Penser. Librement. Si je. Librement. Je vous dirai. Je vous dirai. Je vous dirai que. Je vous dirai que. Si je pouvais penser, si je pouvais librement, si je pouvais librement, si je pouvais penser, si je pouvais penser librement, 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 je vous, si je pouvais penser librement, je vous dirais. Je vous dirais que si je pouvais penser, si je pouvais penser, si je pouvais penser libre, librement, si je pouvais penser librement, si je pouvais penser librement, si je pouvais penser librement, je vous dirais, si je pouvais penser librement, je vous dirais que si je pouvais penser librement, je vous dirais, si je pouvais penser librement, je vous dirais, si je pouvais penser librement, si je pouvais penser librement, si je pouvais penser libre, 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 si je pouvais penser, si je pouvais penser, si je pouvais. vous dirais que si je pouvais penser librement, je vous dirais que si je pouvais penser librement, je vous dirais si je pouvais penser librement, je vous dirais si je pouvais penser librement, 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 si je si je pouvais penser libre, si je pouvais penser libre, si je pouvais penser libre, si je pouvais tout serait bien, 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 tout serait, tout serait, tout serait bien, bien, bien.